Hey, amazing viewers, I love connecting with you all around the world. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share will leave you inspired and ready to take control of your own life. In today's story, you'll hear about an incredible twist that no one saw coming. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze steady, professional. Another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. But today was different. The moment the bailiff called the case, something shifted in the air. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, he announced. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the charges in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system, she thought. But then, something happened. The defendant was brought in, and as soon as she laid eyes on him, the room seemed to tilt. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was no stranger. It was James. Her James. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they made as kids to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man standing before her now wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, and yet, his eyes. Those deep, soulful eyes were unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. James, her childhood friend, was now standing in front of her as a defendant in her courtroom. James looked up. His expression was a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was James. And somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and gavel. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, divided, not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family lived in a modest one-story house with a white picket fence. James's family lived at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met. An accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She offered to help, and that simple gesture turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. Eleanor could still hear James's voice in her head as they lay under the stars. "You ever think about leaving this place? Really getting out, going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond had deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. And then, one day, it all ended. The summer before high school, Eleanor's father had caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside now." She had hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Eleanor's father forbade her from going near James, and soon after, his family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Hammond. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had happened to James after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. What had brought him here, standing before her in shackles? As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, Eleanor felt a growing knot in her stomach. The trial had begun. But for her, it was not just any trial. It was the trial of a lifetime. The man sitting before her, James Anderson, wasn't just a defendant. He was the boy she had once known, the childhood friend she thought she'd lost forever. And now she had to decide his fate. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, rose to deliver his opening statement. His voice was firm and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store, assaulted an innocent clerk, and robbed the store without provocation. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a cold chill run down her spine. The words were straightforward, clinical, impersonal. But the truth of the matter was far more complicated. Could James, the boy who had once shared his dreams with her, really have done this? Was this man, standing before her in shackles, truly capable of the crime he was accused of? She glanced at James, his face stoic, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. There was no visible remorse, no hint of guilt, but neither was there the arrogance one might expect from someone who believed in their own innocence. It was as if he had resigned himself to the inevitable. The prosecutor continued, outlining the details of the alleged crime: a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The store clerk had been injured during a struggle, and the cash register had been emptied. James had been arrested nearby, still in possession of the cash. It seemed like a clear-cut case, but for Eleanor, something didn't add up. As the prosecutor spoke, Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to that summer, the last time she had seen James. The world was different then. They had been children, unaware of the forces that would shape their lives. They had no idea how the weight of the world would push them in opposite directions. No idea that one day their paths would collide like this. Her mind raced. What had happened to James? How had he ended up here, facing charges that could ruin his life forever? She had known him to be kind, thoughtful, full of dreams. He had always wanted more than what Hammond could offer, but life hadn't been kind to him. Had he been forced into a situation where crime seemed like the only option? Had he been caught in a cycle of poverty and struggle, a cycle that seemed impossible to escape? The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose next, her voice confident but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "the prosecution will paint my client, James Anderson, as a violent criminal. But that is not who he is. We will show that there is more to this story. We will show that the evidence is not as clear-cut as it appears." Eleanor listened intently, trying to stay focused on the proceedings. Lisa's argument was based on one simple truth: James maintained his innocence. He had not committed the robbery, but the case against him was strong. The store clerk had identified a man matching James's description. The surveillance footage, though grainy, showed someone wearing a red hoodie. James had been arrested just a few blocks away, and the cash had been found in his possession. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had known James, once upon a time. She had seen the goodness in him, the potential. She had watched him struggle, just as she had. But how could someone who had been her closest friend end up in a place like this? As the day wore on, the courtroom's tension grew. Witness after witness took the stand, each contributing to the story that seemed to trap James in a corner. And yet, Eleanor couldn't stop herself from questioning everything she knew. She had always believed in justice, in the idea that the truth would prevail. But what if the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed? What if James wasn't the person everyone thought he was? The questions continued to gnaw at her as the trial pressed forward, and with every passing moment, Eleanor felt the weight of her role as a judge pressing down on her. She had to remain impartial. She had to be the symbol of justice. But how could she when the truth was so elusive? How could she when the man before her was someone she once called a friend? The trial had reached its final moments, and Eleanor was no closer to the answer she sought. The case had been laid out before her, the evidence presented, and the witnesses heard. The weight of her decision was like a stone pressing against her chest. She had to decide the fate of James Anderson, the boy who once meant everything to her, now standing before her as a man entangled in a life she couldn't understand. But as the courtroom began to empty and the jury deliberated, Eleanor stayed seated, her hands still resting on the polished oak of the bench. She was no longer thinking about the case in the way a judge should. She was thinking about James, about their childhood, about the choices that had led them down separate paths. The story of their lives wasn't black and white. It never had been. She had always believed that people were shaped by their circumstances. Growing up in a small town like Hammond, Louisiana, where the rules were defined by unspoken boundaries and invisible walls, Eleanor had learned early on that those who were born on the right side of town had advantages that others never stood a chance at. She had been fortunate enough to have parents who could afford to send her to college, who could push her to achieve beyond the confines of the town that had tried to trap her. James hadn't had those advantages. His family had struggled, and though his dreams were just as big, the world around him had been less kind, less forgiving. He had never stood a chance against the system that was designed to break people like him. And in the end, that system had caught up to him, dragging him down into a place where survival was the only thing that mattered. Eleanor's gaze wandered to the jury, their faces serious, their minds occupied with the evidence before them. She had to remind herself of her role. She was a judge, and her job was to uphold the law. But even as the prosecutor and defense attorney spoke, she realized that no law could fully account for the intricacies of the human experience. No law could understand the forces that shaped a person's life, the moments that led them to decisions they might never have made if they had been given a different chance. As the courtroom doors opened and the jury returned with their verdict, Eleanor knew that whatever the outcome, it wouldn't be the end of the story. For James, for her, for everyone who had ever found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control, there would always be more to the story. The truth was never as simple as it seemed. People weren't just the sum of their actions. They were the product of their histories, their struggles, their choices. And as the jury declared James Anderson not guilty, Eleanor found herself standing at the crossroads of justice and humanity. She realized that sometimes the most important thing wasn't the verdict at all, but the understanding that no one could ever truly know the full story of another person. What mattered most was the compassion we showed, the empathy we extended, and the willingness to see others beyond the labels they were given. In the end, Eleanor walked away from the trial not with the satisfaction of having done her job, but with a powerful reminder that life isn't about making perfect judgments. It's about giving people the opportunity to rise above their circumstances, to make better choices, and to be seen for who they really are, not just who they've been forced to become. Because in the end, everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story. And Eleanor, like so many others, had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is believe in the possibility of change.